Hello, everyone. My name is Deona Hooper, and I am the founder and editor-in-chief of Social Work Helper. It is a great pleasure today to come live from Berry University to bring this conference to you today. The purpose for this conference is really to try to get people around the world and happy World Social Work Day. It's just tomorrow, but it's World Social Work Day in Australia, so happy World Social Work Day. So the purpose was to try and to engage all time zones, and hopefully this will be an annual project for Social Work Helper. But I'm not going to keep you guys long. We're going to have a great panel for you today. It's going to be on surviving an active shooter, and we have some great professors from Berry who's going to speak to you in just a few minutes. So I'm going to get out of the way, and let's get this presentation started.
Thank you, Dan. Good afternoon from Miami, Florida, and Berry University School of Social Work. My name is Maria Tehan, and I'm the Associate Dean and Assistant Professor here at the School of Social Work. Today, we're trying to cover a large and tragic topic in a very short amount of time, so I would first like to please state a small disclaimer that our conversation here, our dialogue, our narrative is really perfunctory, and we're hoping that it will continue the dialogue across certainly our country and of course the world. We decided to break this up into three main areas. Dr. Michael Ellisi, and I'll have him introduce himself in a few minutes, is really going to be taking the role of social work as an educator, essentially, and bringing forward a didactic, or if you will, a theoretical framework when we talk about a crisis response after an active shooter incident. I'm going to be addressing the social work role within a crisis response for first responders. And then Elaine Cronin is going to be addressing the social work role in terms of school settings and her interventions with the actual students from Stoneman, Douglas, and the other surrounding schools. So we're very honored and privileged to be here with you today. And without further ado, Dr. Michael Ellisi.
Good afternoon. Again, my name is Dr. Michael Ellisi. I'm an adjunct faculty member here at Berry University School of Social Work. I've been a professor for quite some time, but my bulk of my experience is 32 years as a retired police officer with both the City of Miami and the Coral Gables Police Department. So the main objectives of today's workshop will be to examine how the role of emergency preparedness might vary in diverse settings, to provide participants with an opportunity to use information learned throughout this presentation to appreciate the social worker's role and perspective in the aftermath of a situation like this as an active shooter, and to understand the nature and definition of clinical incidents, stress management, and its role on a continuing basis. Able to identify these two elements of the social worker's role in crisis response, and the participants will be able to identify the multifaceted roles of social workers in providing comprehensive services in the wake of a school shooting. Participants will be introduced to the model of interventions developed by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network in response to school violence, psychological first aid for schools, and its application to the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School tragedy. By definition, the active shooter is an individual actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people in the confines of a populated area. In most cases, active shooters use firearms. There is no pattern or method to the selection of victims. However, while victim selection is often very much random, the violent attacks are not. They are meticulously planned, they're resourced, they're rehearsed, and they're very much executed in a very planned style. Just for for statistical purposes, most active shooter type scenarios occur. 24% occur in what's called soft targets like schools, high schools in particular, office buildings, about 11%, open commercial facilities, 24%, factory warehouses, somewhere within the city of 12%, and then others. Of course, we're here to talk about the incident that occurred in Broward County. and that would account for 24% in terms of the school setting. In general, the gender tends to be 96% male, although that was very different in the San Bernardino shooting, where there was a husband and wife involved in that situation. But for the most part, they tend to be of male origin. Number of attackers, usually 98% are single attackers. More or less what happened up in the high school in Broward, or 2%, two or more, but more often than not, it's usually just one person. When we think of two or more, we think of the Columbine shooting in and of itself. The weapons of choice usually is a single weapon. 64% of single weapon, 36% two or more. And usually these are handguns that are purchased legally. 2/3 are semi-automatic handguns, sometimes are modified to the point where they can shoot off rapidly, like a machine gun. And others are a mix of rifles, shotgun, and revolvers. Victims, a typical active shooter attacks result in usually two deaths and 2 wounded. The actual time for most of these shooting incidents is somewhere between the vicinity of 5 to 6 minutes, and after that, the firefight's pretty much over. And that's pretty particular and incidental to most police shootings in general. So let's talk about the types of sources of violence in the workplace. There is a traditional typology, and then there, of course, is the expanded typology. The traditional typology deals with the type 1, the criminal intent, the type 2, the customer-client type of dispute, the type 3, the worker-on-worker type situation or scenario, and then, of course, the type 4, the intimate partner. These are more domestic violence type situations that somehow cross over into a work setting. But because of what's been happening as of late, we've now expanded this typology to the ideological violence type of situations that occur from time to time. Let's explore that if we could. The criminal intent type 1. The perpetrator does not have any legitimate business relationships with the establishment. The primary motive is usually of theft or of criminal nature. The deadly weapon is often used, increasing the risk of fatal injury. Workers who exchange cash, work late hours, or work alone are at a greater risk. These would be like banks, supermarkets, that sort of thing. Most common type of workplace violence is this criminal intent type 1 scenario. 85% of all workplace violence or homicides fall into this category. 3 crimes include robbery, shoplifting, trespassing incidents that turn violent or abruptly turn into a situation where there is a fatality. The type 2 is more the customer-client type scenario. The perpetrator is a customer or client of a worker organization. The violence occurs in conjunction with workers' normal duties. The risk to some workers may be constant. An example, a mental health worker, a police, or routine calls of that nature. We saw this just recently in an incident that occurred in California in a facility where mental health workers, social workers were working, and there was an individual who was a veteran who was suffering from PTSD and other issues and somehow just got out of control. The type 3 is the worker-on-worker type scenario. The perpetrator is an employee or former employee of the organization. The motivating factors are often one of a series of interpersonal or work-related conflicts, losses, or trauma, a sense of injustice or fairness. This happens most often in the case when someone has lost their job and they want some form of retribution. Type 3 violence accounts for about 7% of all workplace homicides, and managers and supervisors are at the greater risk of being victimized. Type 4, the personal relationship. This is more often a spillover of domestic violence into the workplace. Typically refers to perpetrators who are not employees or former employees of the affected workplace. Women are more often the targets in these types of situations. This happens quite often and more routine than you would expect, and it's not often broadcast in the news. Then there's the type 5, the ideological violence. Violence directed at an organization specifically. It's people and or property for ideological, religious, or political reasons by individuals or groups. Violence perpetrated by extremists, value-driven groups, and other true believers also fall within this category. Target selection is not based on the sense of personal or professional injustice in the workplace, but rather range against what the targeted organization does or represents. Neo-Nazis, Nazis, white supremacists, these kind of scenarios. So, You look at these three. This is the one from the congressman who shot the congressman. This is the Aurora shooting incident in the movie theater, and of course the Sandy Hook. What do they have in common? Is there some kind of important commonality or profile that we can come up with? Well, to some extent there is. And forgive me for it may be in comparison with school attackers and assassins. The lone actor tends to be 81% tends to be somewhere in the school attacker as opposed to 70% an assassin, someone who's been trained. Most of them are males, as we said before, somewhere in the 90 to 100% male bracket. In the assassin category, it's about 86%. They tend to be of Caucasian, 76%, as opposed to 77% in the assassin. And the age range somewhere between 11 and 21. This is what we saw in Broward with regards to the school shooting. The assassin tends to be more of a 60 to 73-year-old. This is someone who has some kind of an issue or has been trained. Served in the military, more often than not, most of these shooters are in active shooter scenarios like they'll happen in Broward. This person was not trained in the military. The assassin would be for the most part. Never married, of course, 100% applies in the situation with the Broward shooting, whereas in the assassin, about 49%. High school education or less, 100%. And this, of course, fits the profile of the individual in Broward. Ever arrested? Well, as we see, 27% usually have some kind of criminal or law enforcement type interaction or incident report that's been recorded. So there are always red flags somewhere to be seen. A history of substance abuse, to some extent, yes. But more often than not, these substance abuse type issues are more like gateway type of drugs. Nothing really too serious. And then, of course, the most important thing of all, a history of depression or despair. These things are very common. And we saw this with this individual in Broward. There were many red flags, many issues concerning this person with regards to depression and or despair or feeling despair. So important commonalities, again, if I could just rehash. Both groups of offenders are predominantly male and Caucasian. The school attacker, almost all of them students, are much younger than the assassin, which shows wide variation in age. The relative youth of school attackers is reflected in several other demographic characteristics. No school attackers served in the military, whereas about half of the assassins had served. No school attacker had married. Two groups differ greatly in arrest records, and both attackers, 78% school attackers, or what happened in Broward, as in 44% of those who are trained assassins. The higher rate for school attackers is more striking because assassins had, on average, twice as many years of life in which developed such a history. So again, there are many commonalities, and there are many red flags in the process. I'd like to now pass it over to.
So my area is to specifically talk about the crisis response, the social workers' response from a first responders. You know, it was interesting as I was listening to Dr. Alicia speak. I often think about this as I go around the country and so forth, presenting on this area of trauma. Is so often the language seems so disconnected from the emotional piece. And as educators, we know that we have to do this, but I don't think it really addresses the depth of emotion that we as social workers, as we responded and tried to serve our community, really felt. And so often there's a parallel process in this, in providing this service, as there is in working with our clients. And I just wanted to kind of bring that forward, that this is really a beginning of the dialogue and the narrative of this horrendous tragedy that was that involved our community. But my specific role today is to talk to you about social work response in mass disasters and who's at risk at emotional distress. I want to focus that certainly survivors, friends and families, community members, but for this particular section of our presentation, I'm going to focus on first responders and recovery workers. These are individuals that may experience prolonged separation from loved ones during this time, and disconnect from their community and their support systems because they're immersed in responding to the tragedy. As we know, what research is showing that as many as 45% of those directly exposed to a mass disaster may develop PTSD or depression. I particularly, it was, when we talk about a narrative, it was one of those moments in your life that are transformative and changes your entire worldview. And I was actually in a faculty Senate meeting when I got the text that our team was being deployed. And it was a surreal kind of moment. But what happened is I am trained in a particular process that is called critical incident stress management. And this is an interdisciplinary team. It's peer-driven, and I am one of the clinicians of this team. And so we were deployed, we were put on standby, and we did not go out to the staging area until later on that evening after the event had happened and NICKOLAS CRUZ had been arrested. So what is critical incident stress management? Again, in this short amount of time, we can't go into all the details, but I wanted to focus on the idea that this kind of critical incident response is comprehensive, it is integrated, it's systematic, and it's certainly multi-component. And what we're looking here is when a crisis happens, there's an overwhelming of one's usual coping mechanisms, and that includes first responders. And so what we're trying to do is not psychotherapy. This is not therapy. It is a psychological first aid. It's an acute intervention designed to mitigate the response to the crisis and maximize coping so that the first responder can get back to optimal level of functioning. It's a return to adaptive functioning. It's stabilizing symptoms and teaching being aware of what reactions might be coming forth, and then using that as a means of utilizing adaptive functioning. This is evidence-based. There is evidence and research that shows that if prompt delivery of service and intervention during this time can mitigate PTSD, anxiety, and depression. And so I just wanted to bring that forward as well, so that we are seeing that the quicker someone gets support from that particular perspective during a mass disaster, the more likely they are to return to adaptive coping. So what did we do on that day? February 14th happened, we were deployed, and this is the basic elements of CISM. It is a continuum of care. It is not given in one, it's not one particular element. It starts with what we call pre-incident education, and a major portion of what we do in CISM is educating first responders and the community on trauma, on adaptive functioning, on being aware of reactions and how trauma may impact you, so that you can create opportunities and skill sets in order to mitigate the impact of that trauma on the self. So what we did, and I put those in the different colors. Our first response it's called CMB, it's Crisis Management Briefing. And what happens is the first responders that had gone to the event and the entire community of first responders were staged at a particular facility. So over 500 people ended up showing up that night. And at first we did a mass meeting, the CMB, and there were the administrative team of each particular discipline. So fire rescue was there, law enforcement, the SWAT team, the dispatchers that got the initial call were there. Also the ambulance company were there. So each component of the first responders that had been part of that call arrived. And all in all, there was over 500 people that showed up that night. And what we did in this particular CMB, in the crisis management briefings, it's really about assembling the group, talking about reviewing the typical symptoms. It is also information. It's trying to mitigate rumors. So the administration was there. We allow them to go first. They talk about any rumors, mitigation of rumors. This is not, and I have to really focus on this. This is not an operational debriefing. This is simply to discuss the potential emotional and responses that may be maladaptive to these particular individuals returning to their specific roles in their jobs. So this is not, since it's not an operational debriefing, the administration there is simply there to mitigate any rumors, and then it is presented to us as part of the crisis team to move that meeting forward. But we review typical symptoms that the individuals may be experiencing. We talk about stress. We talk about the impact of stress on the person, and then we talk about some ways to mitigate that. And then we also talk about management of resources. So that's what the CMB is about. And that lasted about, I'd say, roughly 2 hours with everyone there. We then broke up into smaller groups. And although it was not what we call a real debriefing process, we did try to make these groups as homogeneous as possible. When you do a critical incident response and you're doing a debriefing, that group is only made up of the individuals who were at the scene. Any other perfunctory people there are broken up into different other groups, and other teams will then work with them to do that. But we make sure that we try to make each of those teams as homogeneous as possible, because as you can imagine, each of that person who may have responded to the actual event has a different perception of the tragedy as opposed to someone who may have just heard about it or know somebody who responded to the event. So we do try to make sure we honor that experience in that way. And the team is made up of different aspects of law enforcement. So on our particular team, there was fire rescue there were law enforcement representatives there, we had a dispatcher, and then myself as a clinician. And we present information, we present assistance from our point of view. There's a particular aspect, there's a particular model that you go through, asking in terms of who are you, what was your role at the scene, from your perspective, what happened, and what were some of the reactions you might be experiencing, what are some of the first thoughts that you were thinking as you process this scene. And then we do go into that teaching model of stress management. Here are some things you might be experiencing, not just today, but in the future. And here are some things to be ready for. Here are some ways for you to mitigate some of that. And by the way, this is just one step in this process, and that we're available to make referrals or to move you onto the next level of support if necessary. Supportive and compassionate presence. Before I do that, let me just go back. That some of the other things that we did during this period beyond the actual day is we did some small group CMBs, as I shared. We did some debriefings. We did one-on-one peer-driven assessment, but we also did family CISM, which isn't often discussed. And what happened is I also met with the wives and partners of the first responders. They were having a tremendous amount of issues that were bringing forth, not just because their partners and the people they cared about were responding to this tragedy, but as more and more information came forth during after the event, you may recall that all of a sudden people went from being heroes to questions about response, whether or not it was appropriate or not, and did law enforcement and others make appropriate decisions that may have impacted the way that all of this may have turned out. So as this information started to come forward, it didn't just impact the first responders in the community, it was also impacting their partners and their wives and so forth. So we actually did facilitate several family CISM and also pastoral care. As part of the team, we have a chaplain. We have chaplains involved as well in case this is an important piece of what happened. And as you may all know, in the first responder, paramilitary, and in military, chaplains are often an important part of the healing process and are often utilized as part of the intervention team. In fact, when we started the CMD, the chaplain for the fire rescue team actually began and ended the CMB with a blessing, a prayer, if you will, at the participants' request. So some elements to avoid as we're working with first responders, being assured that we're not utilizing cliches, that we're not talking about imposing religious beliefs, at least God was there, or this it happened for a reason. These are things that we have to be careful in identifying as we move through this type of intervention, as it is with any kind of intervention that we provide as social workers and services. As I said, this is not an operational debriefings. We do not get involved as to whether or not they did the right thing or not. Ascribing your own meaning to the event. We're present there, we're walking this journey with our client, just like any other client. Therefore, what comes forward for them is what we stay with and what we witness. Saying you know how the person feels, trying not to take away the pain too fast. This is very critical in crisis intervention, especially when you're working with first responders. As you may know, first responders are there, they're there to fix things. Their identity is based on fixing things, on making things right. And these kinds of emotional responses are not something that they're comfortable with. So witnessing that for them, being present in that, allowing them to feel the sadness, the pain, the anger, acknowledging that is extremely important during process in this journey for them of healing. So we try not to take, we acknowledge the pain of it, but we try not to take the pain away essentially too fast. And as you know, this is grief and loss is something that is ongoing and is not, it's not, I tell my students, grief is not something you cure. It is something it can be transformed. I believe in the hope of healing, but it is not something we're curing. In this particular role, my main role was to allow them to acknowledge that pain and then giving them some coping strategies to move them forward in their jobs. Silence is useful. However, we talk about the fear of silence in the client-worker relationship, and it can be an effective and critical use. But in crisis intervention, you have to be careful because too much silence can connote not knowing, can connote discomfort. So you have to have that balance. And of course, crisis intervention is not appropriate for highly aroused people. If we identify, we're always working together in that process. So if we identify someone who we believe is going to be of concern for us, we will, or somebody walks out during this process, we always have people identified to go and follow them and walk with them and see what kind of support they need. Assuring of what adequate assessment and follow-up is critical, and being careful not to re-traumatize because of a prior incident or memory, which often can come forward in a situation like this. Well, I had a call 2 weeks ago, and I don't really know why I'm dealing with this way, because I had this similar call 5 years ago, or I was in Columbine, and that event didn't bother me, but this one now is just taking me, I can't get myself together. So being careful, being aware of those things. So summary of crisis intervention: remember, it's psychological first aid, not therapy. Remembering foundational clinical skills, reflective listening, paraphrasing, being culturally competent, and competent in terms of discipline as well. Being aware that each discipline that you may be working with, whether it's law enforcement, fire rescue, dispatchers, each have their own set of standards, each have their own set of ideology, and frankly of culture. And so being aware that and becoming informed on those particular disciplines is important. As social workers, connecting to the person in an environment, how the community is responding, all of that is part of the discussion that can come forward in one of these crisis response meetings. The utilization of both CLOs, yes, CLOs, because oftentimes I put down here what we call the diamond structure, starting off sometimes with a close-ended question, just to kind of get the relationship going, and then expanding it to open-ended, and then again, closing it up so you're not leaving the client or the first responders in this case open to the emotional process. Awareness of body language, be ready to repeat information. We know that during a crisis, there is a drop in cognitive skills, so sometimes you have to repeat information over and over again before it's actually starting to solidify. And constructing a narrative is really important. You know, crisis is all about narrative and storytelling, not just as a process, but as an intervention. And what we have found in research is every time someone tells a story of a trauma, what we're finding is that that storytelling itself actually entrains in the brain differently. And that actually changes the scope and how the person perceives that trauma. So it's really important to allow the dialogue and the narrative to come forward. And finally, self-care and vicarious trauma. And I do want to talk a little bit about vicarious trauma. Certainly in all our work, taking care of ourselves, being aware of our triggers, being aware of issues is really important. And certainly we are at risk of vicarious trauma, especially with a tragedy to this level that's impacted the entire, really not just our community, but the world. But I also want to talk about vicarious resiliency, because what has also been shown that providing this type of service as social workers, it actually, there's studies that actually show that as much at risk as we are in terms of vicarious trauma, there are those mirror neurons that fire up during this process, also fire up in terms of resiliency. And so social workers not only are learning can not only have an aspect of vicarious trauma to this, we also are learning vicarious resiliency from our clients and from when we respond to these events. Because the strength and courage, and one of the things that has constantly overwhelmed me, especially during this particular time when I've been assisting with Stoneman Douglas, that has really humbled me, is the constant support and courage and endurance that people have shown, and the resiliency is overwhelming. So I wanted to really end on that and just give you a summary of crisis intervention. These are only just two. One of them is from the International Crisis Critical Incident Stress Foundation. It's what they call their SAFER model. It's a crisis response model. And really the focus here is to stabilize the situation, acknowledge the crisis, facilitate understanding of that crisis, encourage effective coping, and then recovery or referral. Many years ago, when I was working at a hospice and I was doing training on grief and loss, I came up with this little acronym really and it's certainly not all-encompassing, but I wanted to just kind of bring that forward to talk about some of the areas that I think are important as I go out there and provide this type of service and feel blessed to do so, and that is validating the pain of it, validating that event, validating what the individual is feeling, helping them to identify what those emotions are. So often, especially when I work with first responders, they're not used to touching or connecting to those emotional dysregulations. So talking about that is really important, helping them to identify what those emotions are so that they can take those and break them down into smaller pieces, helping them to normalize their responses and their reactions, and helping them then to express them in a more healthy and optimum level process, and finally helping them to learn self-regulation skills, because as we know, for anyone who works trauma, unless you are regulated in your body, there is no intervention, there is no service that you can provide that will move the person into a healing area. And finally, and not least, but what does that say? Last but not least, is instilling hope. Instilling hope that even though our worldview has shifted, there is still hope for healing and transformation. So with that, I'm going to give it to Elaine Cronin. Elaine?
Good afternoon. My name is Elaine Cronin. I was a school social worker for 24 years with the Broward County Public School System. Recently, I returned to the Broward County Public School System to cover for an individual who had gone on family medical leave. In that process, the disaster happened at Stoneman Douglas High School. I'm part-time faculty here at Barry University, and I'm also a graduate of Barry University. So I want to tell you a little bit about this community. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School was founded in 1990. It is literally built on the edge of the Everglades, and it's named after the woman who really saved the Everglades through her political activism. Unfortunately, it is the third deadliest school shooting. 65% of the students in Marjorie Stoneman Douglas are in AP courses, which means that they're earning college credits while they're still in high school. Stoneman Douglas High School has been an A school since it opened, except for 1 year. On February 14th, 2018, the school changed forever. Over 3,000 children were exposed to violence. Many cannot get that out of their head. Many teachers and support staff cannot forget that day. And probably as time goes on, will never forget that day, but they will start dealing with it better. Just think of the logistics. There was a fire alarm drill that day, earlier in the day. Then right at dismissal time, there's another fire drill. Students, faculty, administration they couldn't understand what was going on. So as the shooter entered the building, NICKOLAS CRUZ came through the back. He had on a Marjorie Stoneman Douglas t-shirt. He had on the school colors, and he had an AR. He had an automatic rifle, and he went into the freshman building, which is the building 200, and started firing. NICKOLAS had a lot of problems. NICKOLAS was diagnosed with developmental delay as a preschooler. He was adopted by a couple at birth. They were older, but they didn't really quite understand his needs. Unfortunately, his adoptive father died when he was 5 years old, and his adoptive mother died just last November 2017. NICKOLAS attended Cross Creek School, which is a special school for children who have the disability of emotionally and behaviorally disordered. At that school, he had extra support. He had staff that understand his disability, but he never wanted to have that disability, and he wanted to go to a normal school. When he turned 18, he waived his rights for exceptional student education, and he started going to Stoneman Douglas High School. Initially, he was okay. Later on, we start to see a deterioration. He was disruptive, he was expelled twice, and he was sent to an alternative program. When he entered that school that day, it is rumored that he had been wanting to have a girlfriend for some time, and that he had been stalking a girl. Although we do not know if that's true or not, but it may have been a factor. He killed 17 people, and he wounded 17 people. So there's a movement going on at the school. Many of the students are actually tattooing the number 17 on their bodies. Just last Wednesday, when we had a month memorial to those victims, many of the schools made, the student bodies would go out into the open areas. They made a heart and they put the number 17 with their bodies. By the next day, already, Parkland is a community that is very affluent. Homes start at $855,000 and more, and they go up to double-digit millions. So these individuals are, many of them are connected in terms of where they practice their religion, in the activities that their children enjoy, and in sports activities. When the children were evacuated, many of them went to Heron Bay, which is a golf course and community center, where they were picked up by their parents. There were crisis team members there because, as you can imagine, if you're waiting to see your child and the buses after buses come and your child is not on any of those buses. So the only thing that can come through your head is either my child is at the hospital, they transported them, or my child is no longer here. So when the community came together on the 15th, most of the students that I worked with had attended that service. Many of them the next day were still literally shaken. They were crying, but they said they wanted to come to, well, in the feeder schools, they said that they wanted to come to school because they just wanted something normal to do that. So Parkland has really created a movement. I think because these students are so exceptional, they are really movers and shakers. We may see some of them go into politics one day. But all over the community, there was like a black shadow or a black cloud over that community. You don't hear the laughter, you don't see the people moving around. Many of the students were unable to go to their homes because it was such a crisis with the ambulance and emergency care. None of it, but you couldn't move down the streets. One girl told me that they just kept driving around because they couldn't get into their community because it was blocked, because it was a crime scene. So churches everywhere had vigils, and it was healing for those students. It was healing because they were remembering those students that are lost, and they're showing that they're care. And many times in a situation like this, when students can help someone else, it helps them move from the grief and into the healing. The community really rallied together for Marjory Stoneman Douglas students. The Family Assistance Center, which was staffed by Broward County school personnel as well as private providers, was open the following weekend. The pickup and reunification areas were provided by local businesses. Local clergy and student services of Broward County Public Schools provided grief counseling at pickup centers and crisis counseling at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School and feeder schools. We really need to look at an interdisciplinary response because the teachers who are there to support and teach the students are also suffering their own loss of never having gone through something like this. I served on the crisis team for Broward County Public Schools for 6 years and never had anything that reverberated in the community, never had anything that affected so many people in a whole city like Parkland. So we need to help the teachers, help the students. And I think that the wisdom of our superintendent was exceptional in that having the school closed, and one reason of having the school closed was that entire freshman building has been fenced off because students have to feel comfortable to come back to school. And having the scene of the most drastic shootings, having that closed off so they don't have to even go in that building is very effective. Having them come back and not really have to learn for the first 2 days, they came back, they had partial days, and literally what they did was they just to try to cross that threshold from the school where so much damage had happened, so many lives lost, to be able to sit in their classroom and be with each other. And many of them said how comforting it was to be with their classmates. Initially, many of them laughed. Not laughed, but they were giddy. They were giddy because of the fear that they felt when they re-entered that school. But with the counselors there and with their teachers there, they were able to really start to relax. And by the end of the day, they started talking seriously about how they could move on. So with teachers, we want them to prepare and assure students that they will be okay. That's number one. Trying to let them feel comfortable in the school atmosphere. Not using media, not letting, I can't believe the number of middle schoolers that had Snapchat of the actual shooting, and we're looking at those things. And they need to show empathy for what they are going through and make time to listen. For school social workers and school psychologists, we are in a very critical position of being familiar with the school policies, familiar with the schools and the community, and can do crisis counseling. We also looked at trying to refer, and this is something that the Family Assistance Center did, was refer to other providers. So all that was going on at the Family Assistance Center. We based the Superintendent Runcie sent out to all the schools the guidelines that were developed by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and it goes into these core actions: contact and engagement, stabilization, information gathering, what are their current needs and their concerns, and practical assistance, whatever you can do to help them with some things that are bothering them. None of the kids could take their backpacks home that day. Some of them are lost. So there's things like that they need to have replaced. Connection with social supports, information on coping, and linkage with collaborative services. When the kids and the teachers first came back, one of the recommendations of first aid for schools is to use the therapy dogs. So the therapy dogs were very, very helpful for the teachers as well as the students when they first came back. I think what is also different because of this unique population in the high school is that they really transformed their anguish into action. And they really started looking at, we're going to fight for gun control. On March 9th, Governor Rick Scott signs the gun bill into law. It is the first gun control bill in almost 30 years in the legislature in Florida that has passed. So we look at some of the measures that it does. The legislation changes the minimum age to buy rifles and shotguns from 18 to 21, extends a 3-day waiting period for handgun purchases, and allows some school staffers to be armed. Moving forward, students, parents, and faculty gear up for the March on Washington for Gun Safety on March 24th, just right around the corner. The parent of slain student Nettle Pollock states that he and other parents plan on ongoing and hitting every state to make sure they follow the lead of Florida. One of the things that has been helpful for the students in terms of healing is the arts. There was a performance by the students at the CNN Community Talk at the BB&T Center in Broward County. They performed there. We're also going to have a concert on May 16th that's been put together by a combination of promoters. Lastly, there's a teen, age 14, a freshman at Stoneman Douglas High School, who's always enjoyed singing. She's been singing since she's 4 years old. But after she lost her best friend in the shooting, she can't even listen to music. So she found an outlet in poetry. So I'm going to read to you her poem. We walked into class together and sat down. It was Valentine's Day in our sweet Parkland town. We were laughing and doing our work, me and my best friend. But little did I know that 5 minutes later, her life would come to an end. I hear a sound. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Gunshots? That's funny. Alyssa, of course, will survive. We live in Parkland, I thought. How could this be? But sometimes your thoughts are not what you see. We run under the table in disbelief. I have my friends next to me. What a relief. They moved to the desk to seek safer shelter, but I stayed there thinking the sound was just bad weather. I closed my eyes and wait for my teacher to say it's a drill. But before I knew it, our door was shot through. I saw his first kill. Elena, Alex, Justin, then Alyssa. I'm next, and this is not just paranoia. He went to the next floor and the next. All I could think about is, how many will be left? The screams blasting in my ear, the blood still won't disappear. I screamed their names, called to my friends. Nothing else to do. They are gone. They are dead. Didn't think I would live my worst nightmare. I kept hearing shots and seeing gunpowder in the air. I run home and check the news. How could you do this, Nick Cruz? More and more I find out die. I wish this didn't happen and he never got inside. No feelings, no emotions. How can you comprehend this traumatic distortion? There are no words to describe, nothing else to say that will justify my English class on Valentine's Day. So we're going to take questions. If anyone has some questions, we're here to answer.
So we really only have one question that came in. And the question is, where can someone be trained in CISM?
So the question was, where can someone be trained in CISM? CISM is part of the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation, ICISF, which is in Maryland. And if that person wants more information, they can contact me at my email, nthan@berry.edu, and I'll be happy to send them the link and the information.
Okay, we have another question. It says, are there long-term plans for mental health counseling to support these students, or are there referrals provided to local MH professionals to support the students?
So do you want to repeat the question?
Oh, okay. The question is, are there long-term plans to help these students in terms of mental health counseling? And we have a number of organizations, Jewish Family Services, University of Miami, as well as other providers that are willing to do that. There's also the GoFundMe for Stoneman Douglas students that is funding every student who wants counseling, long-term counseling, will be paid for through that fund. I also want to mention, one of the things that the superintendent is really looking at is to look at what happened to NICKOLAS CRUZ and to make sure that other students who feel disintegrated or just not part of the school culture, that they are not forgotten, and that we can put some more upfront kinds of interventions so that will not happen again.
I'm so glad you brought that forward, Elaine, because connecting with one of our colleagues who spoke earlier, and she mentioned that was Dr. Jennifer Williams, and in her presentation, she brought forward the ACE study and how we're finding, and I'd be interested in hearing if Michael, what Michael's experiences in terms of connecting these active shooters with their ACE scores and their experience and adverse childhood experiences, because I think that's one of the things that has come forward. NICKOLAS had been identified. It isn't unlike some of the ones that you had talked about in terms of the other types that have not been identified with their past traumatic history. and experiences. And I'm so grateful that you brought that forward, because I think that that is one of the things that we've noticed as we know more and more about NICKOLAS' involvement, and that is his continued trauma throughout his life, abandonment issues, death and loss and grief. That does not excuse by any sense the actual act. But I think, as the superintendent spoke about, it helps us as a community and as a mental health community, the importance of identification and providing services and the need for our profession more than ever.
NICKOLAS was in JROTC, and he actually did learn to fight and learn to use a rifle in JROTC, and he was dismissed from that because of his fascination with guns. So again, unfortunately, we saw a red flag, very prominent, that those guns should have been removed from where he lived. And the other unique situation is NICKOLAS is still alive, where other school shooters have killed themselves. So we still have that opportunity to really look at where could those threads of prevention come in from him.
I have a question also, and I could be wrong, and I'm not sure, but didn't this case also have a white nationalist component to it as well?
That has been dismissed. There were swastikas on the magazine cases that were left on the Stoneman Douglas campus that he had used, but that hasn't really worked out. That hasn't really been finalized. That's true.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yay!
All right.